thank you, and it's nice to welcome you all here to Ryerson. And again, I do work in the field of biogeochemistry, which kind of touches on a number of different disciplines. I'm interested in how materials are processed in an ecosystem, and as one of the offshoots of that, quite often as a byproduct of a lot of biogeochemical processes, there are gases that are produced and released, and these are greenhouse gases. And so today's talk is going to be looking at greenhouse gases. So when I say the true north, strong, and gassy, I'm not talking about Canadians, and I'm not talking about professors, not even Toronto politicians. I'm talking about greenhouse gases. Okay, so to begin with, let me go back here for just a moment. I don't, when you talk about greenhouse gases, there's always this danger that, oh no, we're in for another gloomy talk on a gloomy day. And I don't want you to take it as that type of a talk, but I am also going to tell you there's not a happy anecdote at the end where we talk about polar bears and vitamin D. It's I just feel that it's in your interest to really understand what the vulnerabilities are of Canada, and to understand how our natural ecosystems may actually fuel further change, which again poises Canada in a fairly vulnerable position when it comes to climate change, so that you're aware. Okay, so to begin with, there's the question of what are greenhouse gases. Now, I came over, I forgot my little demonstration here, but imagine that I had a bottle of water, and it was red. I add red food coloring to water, or I can add blue food coloring to water. And think about the question of what makes this bottle of water red, or what makes that bottle of water blue. Okay? It's the molecules of the dye that are inside that bottle, and the bonds within that dye that are absorbing certain wavelengths of radiation and reflecting others. Okay? So for example, something that's blue is blue largely because it's absorbing red. Okay, and reflecting blue. And the opposite is true for something that's red color. Okay, so that's something that you can kind of visualize. You can think about something where we're looking at particles of dye in water and looking at absorption and reflection. So this is just showing an absorption spectra for a red and blue water sample. And again, you can see with the red sample, with that red trace, what you see is wavelengths at about 500 nanometers are absorbed most intensely. That's the absorption maxima for that dye. But if you look at the high end of that absorption spectra, in about the 650 nanometer range, which is red light, you see that light's not absorbed, it's reflected back, and so the sample appears red. And blue is the opposite. If we look at the blue trace, we see that none of the blue light down near the 400 to 450 nanometers is absorbed. Instead, that's reflected back, and it's actually the red light that's absorbed. Okay? Now, I explain all of that as kind of an introduction to understanding greenhouse gases. Gases work the same way as the dye. You have molecules of gas that are in the air, and they have their own absorption maxima. They have wavelengths that they absorb, where the bonds absorb energy and then re-radiate that energy. Okay? So if we think about what's actually happening in terms of incoming radiation that's coming from the sun is striking the Earth, and the majority of the radiation that's hitting the Earth is actually coming in the form of visible light. So if you look at that blue trace on the left, what you'll see is that the peak in terms of radiation is really right around 500 nanometers. That's visible light. That's part of the visible light spectrum. But when the light strikes the Earth, some of that energy, some of that light energy is absorbed and re-radiated back to the atmosphere. But there's a shift, and with that shift, a lot of the energy that's re-radiated is radiated at longer wavelengths. And you can see that the peak there is somewhere around 10 microns. That's infrared. Okay? Now, so what are greenhouse gases? Greenhouse gases are gases that have their absorption maxima. You can think back to that example I showed you with the red and the blue water samples. These have their absorption maxima at longer wavelengths within the infrared range. So these are gases that are in the air, and they absorb radiation in the infrared range and then re-radiate that energy. So what we're talking about then is heat. Okay, so what are the important greenhouse gases? This is just showing 4 of the most important greenhouse gases. And what you'll see here is this is a trace that's very similar to what we had let me go back here. Which one is my laser pointer? Okay, so what you see here is, again, a scale here in terms of wavelength. And it's reversed from what we were looking at before, where these are the shorter wavelengths and these are the longer wavelengths. But all of this entire scale, or most of this scale, is in the infrared range. Now, one of the things you'll see is that there are certain gases, like look at CO2, for example, where you see certain peaks. So you see a peak of absorbance for CO2 somewhere around 600 nanometers, so that's within the visible wavelength. But what's really important, and why we talk about CO2 so much, is it also has this absorption peak, which is right around 2400 nanometers. That's what makes CO2 a greenhouse gas. Okay? The ability to absorb that wavelength of energy and re-radiate it as heat. We also see nitrous oxide. Okay, nitrous oxide is here in green, and we see again a peak here that's around near infrared, about 1200 nanometers. We see another peak here that's about 22 to 2300 nanometers. And similarly, we see peaks of absorption peaks for methane and for water as well. Okay? Now, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind here is that the greenhouse effect is a natural effect. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas. And in fact, the greenhouse effect in general isn't a bad thing. It's the reason that we're not a ball of ice. Okay? Water vapor allows the Earth to be habitable. But what we're really interested in here is when we produce or release gases like CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane in abundance, they have the ability to absorb radiation in that infrared range and contribute to heating. Okay, so getting back to the question, which are the important greenhouse gases? CO2, obviously, and that's the one that we always hear about. You know, we always hear about CO2 and greenhouse effect, but nitrous oxide and methane are also very important here. So methane has about, I highlight methane, it has about 20 times the effect of CO2. What I mean by that is, if you release a mole of CO2 and a mole of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the methane will actually have 20 times more effect on global warming than this carbon dioxide. And that's related to a couple of different things. One is the relationship with the wavelengths that it absorbs, so the maximum absorption spectrum. And the other thing that it relates to is longevity in the atmosphere. Okay? Nitrous oxide is the same. So nitrous oxide actually has about 310 times the radiative forcing of CO2, largely because of its longevity. Once you release it into the atmosphere, it's fairly stable in the atmosphere. But it has about 0.1% the concentration. So if we think about like what are the important greenhouse gases, obviously CO2. But about 10% of the radiative forcing is actually coming from nitrous oxide. So we'll be talking about sources of N2O, sources of methane, and some natural sources of CO2. Okay. So greenhouse gases have a diversity of sources, and most of you are familiar with a lot of these sources. I mean, the obvious one is combustion of fossil fuels, which is a source of CO2. This can be industrial scale processes that are using fossil fuels. It can include things like the drive-in to Toronto, but it can also include things like energy generation for our own personal use and comfort. Okay, that's obvious. That doesn't surprise anyone. What you may not be familiar with is the importance of concrete. The manufacture of concrete is a major source of CO2 outside of the transportation and energy sector. Okay, agriculture. One of the major sources of nitrous oxide, actually the most important source of nitrous oxide that's anthropogenic, that's caused by us, is actually through agriculture. And what you'll see is you know, if we're looking at this spreader is busy applying a dry powdered fertilizer to that field. That fertilizer is mostly in the form of ammonia, and bacteria that are in the soil are going to take that ammonia and convert it into nitrate. This is something that bacteria are going to do as a natural process. There's a group of bacteria that are referred to as nitrifiers, and they oxidize ammonia to nitrate, and they use that energy to grow. They use that energy to produce carbon. But it's sort of like, you can imagine kind of a scenario of the bacteria being almost like customers at a buffet. If they're given a lot of ammonia, they become sloppy eaters. Okay? They end up using ammonia in a fairly inefficient way. And one of the things that will happen is, as a byproduct of nitrification, there's going to be some amount of nitrous oxide that's produced as that byproduct, and it is evades to the atmosphere. Okay? Now this next one might be a little bit of a surprise to you. I mean, how could these beautiful peatlands and lakes be culprits in greenhouse gas and climate change? One of the things that we see here, if you look at these landscapes, there's a lot of peaty soil there. There's a lot of water features, a lot of lakes and small streams here. But what's happening within those lakes, within those soils, let's take the soil first. Here's a peaty soil, looking at it in cross-section, and you've got organic carbon that's buried in that soil. Up in the upper part of that soil profile, where there's plenty of oxygen, you're going to have aerobic respiration, and some of that organic carbon gets converted into CO2, greenhouse gas. If we go deeper in the soil profile, where we're in water-saturated state and we end up with more anaerobic conditions, a lot of that organic carbon is going to be converted into methane. And again, that evades to the atmosphere and contributes to climate change potentially, or warming. Okay, if we think about lakes, what's happening in the lakes as part of that landscape, some amount of nitrate is in the water column. So we have nitrate in the water. That nitrate, incidentally, may be coming from agriculture, which we talked about before. So those two sources become linked. But that nitrate that's in the water, through a different process of bacterial activity, can be converted into nitrogen gas and go into the atmosphere. But just as I mentioned before, that whole sloppy eater principle, when there's plenty of nitrate, a lot of the nitrate is converted to nitrous oxide rather than N2 as a final product. And so that nitrous oxide is produced and escapes to the atmosphere. Okay, so then as I look at this landscape, you and I may look at this landscape in slightly different ways then. You may look at this landscape as beautiful and idyllic. I look at it as beautiful and idyllic, yet as a major source potentially of greenhouse gases. Okay, so how important are natural sources? So for the rest of the talk here, I'm going to focus a little bit more on these natural sources, because I think it's important for us to think about and understand, as one of the vulnerabilities of Canada and the far north in particular, is that these natural systems have the potential to tip and become major sources of greenhouse gases. So as climate change warms the north, we have the potential for these natural systems to contribute to ever greater greenhouse gas release and ever greater warming as part of a positive feedback cycle. Okay, so we're going to be looking at what are some of the implications of climate change in the far north, and what is that going to mean in terms of these natural systems as source of greenhouse gases. So to begin with, here's a map that's showing soil carbon concentrations throughout Canada. And one of the things that you'll notice as you look at that map is it's a very red map. Okay, red is high. If we look at our scale down here, this is soil organic carbon. The red and the orange represent high carbon. Most of that's high carbon. So there's a lot of carbon that's stored in soils, particularly the farther north you go. And so here we're talking about things such as peatlands. There's a lot, extensive peatlands, a lot of organic carbon that's buried in soil that's poised to be mineralized and produce things like CO2 and methane. Okay? This map doesn't really show up great in the lighting, but this is a Google image map, and what you ideally would be able to see are a lot of little blue dots scattered across particularly northern Canada, representing lakes. So in addition to Canada having a lot of buried organic carbon, it also has a lot of lakes which are potential sources for things like methane and nitrous oxide. Okay, but this isn't what we see when we look at the landscape. We don't get the Landsat image. This is what it actually looks like at ground level. Okay, so what we're looking at here is some of those northern biomes. So we're looking at an ice field. This is a tundra during much of the year. So during much of the year, the tundra is frozen over, has a high level of icing, and then this is what it looks like during the summer, during the very brief part of the year. So this is what northern landscapes look like. So I can ask the question, like, why is there so much carbon buried in soil in the north? Well, because it's frozen most of the year. So bacteria aren't able to convert most of that carbon into CO2 and methane. Okay? If bacteria are basically limited by temperature, then we end up getting accumulation of organic carbon in the soil over time. Okay? Here are lakes. Okay, just lakes at the ground level in the far north look like this for most of the year. They're iced over. Okay, so even though this image in particular I really like, because if you look at all these little swirls, what you're seeing there are gas bubbles that are trapped in the ice. There's a lot going on in this lake. There are a lot of gases being produced, in particular methane and nitrous oxide, that are being trapped and not released to the atmosphere. And so this ice serves as a cap that prevents these gases from getting into the atmosphere. Okay? But guess what? When the ice is gone, what happens? That gas escapes into the atmosphere. Okay, so the next thing I want to show are some current images, some current maps looking at what are referred to as temperature anomalies. If you're not familiar with temperature anomalies, basically what we're looking at here is, let's suppose that we take a baseline average, and in this case, the baseline average that's generally used for temperature anomalies are the 50s, 60s, and 70s. If we look at the average temperature over those 3 decades, we can then look at what is the anomaly or the difference from that mean at a given point in time. And this map is just showing temperature anomalies globally in the winter of 2013. One of the things that you'll notice is that the anomalies are particularly sensitive to latitude. In the far north, we end up getting some of the greatest temperature anomalies. Particularly look at northern Canada, where you might see temperature anomalies as great as 4 degrees Celsius. Now this is winter, and winter tends to be when these anomalies are most pronounced. But we also see temperature anomalies throughout the year. So if I showed you a summer image, it would be pretty similar here, although probably not as intense. So, and in fact, that's what I'm showing you. So here's the temperature anomalies in the summertime. But if we plot those over time, what you'll notice is that the north is, in fact, warming. Okay, we do see an increase in, this is a temperature anomaly chart that's showing northern latitude. So this is the Arctic. And we are seeing that the temperatures are increasing in the Arctic over the last few decades. And so the question is, how does that feed back into some of the things that we've already been talking about in terms of impacts on northern ecosystems and what that means for northern ecosystems in terms of their own greenhouse gas production. So to begin with, I want to remind you, in case you're not aware of what I mean by a positive feedback loop. A positive feedback loop is a loop of causality where A causes B and B in turn causes A. So for example, I'm hungry, A. I think of food, B. That makes me even more hungry, A, which makes me think of food even more, B. As you can see, I'm caught in that feedback loop a lot. Okay, that's me. But we can also think about feedback loops in terms of the broader question that we're asking here. So here's a positive feedback loop that relates to greenhouse gases and Canada. An increase in greenhouse gases results in the increase in temperature, which I just showed you for the north. Okay? The increase in temperature results in a decrease in things like ice cover. So a lot less ice cover. Ground is not frozen for the entirety of the year. Lakes are not covered with ice for the entirety of the year. A decrease in ice cover can also change biological activity. Temperature is related to biological activity. And biological activity is precisely what's driving production of greenhouse gases. So respiration is producing these greenhouse gases. Okay? So there are a number of possible scenarios here in terms of positive feedback. There are different ways that positive feedback can function. So here I'm looking at 3 different landscapes, 2 of which you saw before. So here's again that frozen tundra landscape. Here's what the tundra looks like when it's not covered with ice. And this is a boreal forest. Okay, the boreal forest is basically the biome that bumps up against the tundra. Okay, it's at the next coldest extreme in terms of northern biomes. So here's the point. If we look at this biome, if we look at the ice-covered tundra versus the thawed tundra, what's the difference in terms of color? The main difference is that this is a lighter color, this is a little bit darker color. This is going to be a much more reflective surface. Okay, so when I'm talking about albedo, what I'm talking about is the reflectance of the surface. Okay, so a system that has a lot of ice cover is going to have high albedo. A lot of energy strikes the surface of the Earth and is re-radiated back. So it's basically reflected back, still in the visible spectrum. That doesn't really contribute to heating. This system here has a little bit darker color. And this little bit darker color allows for more of that sunlight to be absorbed and re-radiated in the infrared spectrum. But as temperatures increase in the north, we start to see boreal forests encroach upon tundra. We start to see the advance of the leading edge of the boreal forests. And what you'll notice there is that the color is even darker. So this is even more effective in terms of absorbing radiation and re-radiating in the infrared range. Okay, so albedo effects contribute to a positive feedback in terms of warming in the north. Okay, another positive feedback it has to do with agriculture and the expansion of agriculture. So this map is showing these little areas in red are general agricultural areas. Okay, this is present, and this is showing future predicted agricultural areas. Not a dramatic change, but what you'll see is an expansion of an expected or predicted expansion of agriculture further north. Now, how does that affect greenhouse gases? That's an additional area, additional land mass, which incidentally is nutrient poor, which means a lot of nitrogen fertilizer would be applied, and the consequence would be an increase in nitrous oxide release. Nitrous oxide production, nitrous oxide release. So when you have more land under cultivation and when you are relying heavily on nitrogen fertilizers, you can anticipate more nitrous oxide, which, remember, nitrous oxide has a very high global warming potential on a per mole basis. The other major feedback, and again, I'm re-showing some of the same pictures here, has to do with biological activity. As temperatures increase, what happens to biological activity? It also increases. Partly this is because the soil isn't frozen for as much of the year, and there's the potential for respiration. But also we end up having a relationship between temperature and biological activity. When temperatures tend to be higher, bacteria are more active and fungi are more active. And so as a consequence, we can expect to see more organic carbon converted to CO2, more organic carbon converted to methane. Now I've got to acknowledge that we may also see a lot more CO2 being stored, being sequestered due to higher plant activity. But on net, what we would anticipate from peatlands is a net flux of methane into the atmosphere with temperatures increasing. Okay, and then finally, think back to that picture that you saw with the lakes. where you had all of those little bubbles trapped under the ice or trapped within the ice. As long as there's ice cover, those gases can be produced, but they never actually evade the lake. They never get out into the atmosphere. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that if we look at permanently frozen lakes, permanently ice-covered lakes in the Arctic, you can see concentrations of nitrous oxide and to a lesser degree methane that are 20 to 30 times saturation. Huge amounts of these gases that are trapped in the water, but if the ice remains intact, those gases never evade to the atmosphere. But as the North warms, as we see those anomalies that we talked about before, and we end up getting higher temperatures during the winter, we end up with more periods of the time where the ice is broken up, but also we see more periods of the time where the ice is, we start to see fewer lakes which are permanently ice covered. And so as a result, this excess nitrous oxide that can build up when the ice breaks up has a chance now to evade to the atmosphere. Again, all of those little bubbles you saw in that one picture are now escaping into the atmosphere. Okay, so what are the implications? Just to wrap up then, what are the implications of warming in the north? One is a decreased albedo, so less energy reflected, meaning more re-radiated energy in the infrared range. Number two is an expansion of agriculture in nutrient-poor soils, so we end up expecting an increase in fertilizer use over a larger land mass and increased emissions of nitrous oxide. Okay, third is increased mineralization of organic carbon in carbon-rich soils, and again, that should increase both CO2 as well as methane emissions. Fourth, we should expect to see a decrease in terms of ice coverage of northern lakes, which once again, as I just mentioned, can increase nitrous oxide emissions to the atmosphere. So all of these collectively should make these northern systems, which we think of as fairly pristine, into culprits in terms of future climate change. These systems now become poised for all of that buried carbon to be released back into the atmosphere, for the nitrogen that's going to be added to systems in the form of fertilizer to get into lakes and to be released as nitrous oxide. Okay? So again, I don't have a happy anecdote or a sad anecdote to end on. I just want you to kind of keep in mind when we talk about northern climates, when we talk about the far north and its vulnerability to climate change, keep in mind that in future there's the potential for these northern systems to accelerate the rate of their own change as we start to see the emissions of more greenhouse gases directly from those systems. Okay. All right, thank you very much.